The war in Ukraine has entered another phase, one marked by shifting front lines, by political maneuvering, not just from Russia and Ukraine, but also from the United States, and the unsettling spectre that the United States messing around has generated of Western disengagement. And Putin has once again toured occupied regions, delivering Tsarist era icons like a delusional history enthusiast rather than a 21st century leader. I don't. I look at the footage here. It doesn't look like Putin. It looks like somebody who might have lost his false teeth, but it doesn't look like Putin. Ukraine, battered not broken, clings to the hope of a successful counter-offensive, despite suffering setbacks in Kursk, setbacks which were generated by Donald Trump's manoeuvring. And meanwhile, Trump, never one to avoid inserting himself into a crisis, has effectively used strong-armed tactics to push Zelensky into considering a ceasefire that smells suspiciously like capitulation. So what next? Has Ukraine bent too far under external pressure? Can it still reclaim lost ground? And more crucially, has Trump's intervention altered the course of the war or merely added to the confusion in a way that plays straight into Putin's hands? While Russia continues its grinding advance in places like Bakhmut and Kursk, the reality is far less triumphant than the Kremlin would have you believe. Putin's battlefield visits are largely performance, meant to shore up domestic support and convince Russians that the war is, if not victorious, at least proceeding according to some sort of plan. And of course, it's not Putin doing this, it's a doppelganger. And you've got to remember that Russia now controls less territory than it controlled 3 years ago. The war remains a costly quagmire for Moscow. Putin's forces have taken immense losses, with the Wagner Group now a footnote in history and Russia increasingly reliant on North Korean artillery shells. And the latest offensive in Kursk may have caught Ukraine off guard, but it's hardly a decisive blow. Even in capturing Sudzha, Russia faces the same problem it encountered since 2022. Holding land is vastly different from securing a long-term victory. Putin's visit to the front lines reflects both confidence and anxiety. He wants to project an image of a leader in control, but he knows that any perception of weakness is politically fatal. He should have put in his false teeth. Zelensky's recent moves suggest a leader navigating an impossible situation. Western patience is waning. Trump's vacillation controls so much of the narrative. And the withdrawal from Kursk is framed as saving Ukrainian lives, but it undoubtedly represents a setback. The most controversial question is whether Ukraine has conceded too much. And the idea of a ceasefire is being floated, one that, if accepted, would allow Russia to consolidate gains, rebuild its military, and return stronger in the future. The parallels to the Minsk agreements, which Russia repeatedly violated, are clear. For Ukraine, any peace that doesn't include a full withdrawal of Russian troops is little more than a pause before another more aggressive war. But Zelensky isn't negotiating from a position of strength. The US has cut off intelligence sharing, even if it's now restored, effectively blinding Ukraine's high-tech military systems. Military aid has been slowed. Elon Musk, ever the disruptor, has threatened to withdraw Starlink capabilities, crippling Ukraine's communications. These moves, have forced Zelensky into a pragmatic, if desperate, attempt to salvage Western support by engaging in talks that would have been unthinkable just months ago. But is this surrender? Or is it simply a temporary concession to ensure Ukraine survives long enough to reassemble? The question of whether Ukraine can reclaim lost ground depends on three key factors. One, the renewal of Western military support. And if aid resumes at previous levels, especially in the form of long-range missiles, drones, and air defense systems, Ukraine could regain the upper hand. But if Trump, or even a cautious Western alliance, even the EU, continues restricting or failing to supply resources, then Ukraine's ability to launch any meaningful counteroffensive will be hampered. Ukraine has suffered devastating casualties at home. The heroic resistance seen in 2022 is harder to sustain indefinitely, but morale remains relatively high, particularly among younger Ukrainians who see this as a fight for existence. The Russian military is riddled, meanwhile, with logistical nightmares, corruption, a dependence on an aging Soviet-era system and equipment, and the Kursk offensive is a success, but it's not an overwhelming one. If Ukraine can hold the line in key areas, Russia may still face a drawn-out war it cannot afford. While Ukraine could mount another counter-offensive, the timeline for such an operation is slipping away. It depends entirely on whether the West is willing to step back in, something that looks increasingly uncertain, or whether it's prepared to properly support Ukraine with weapons, with logistics, with defense. Ukraine needs a defensive shield. It needs an Iron Dome. And that, I think, would be the most valuable support that the West could give to Ukraine. Trump's intervention in Ukraine has been predictably chaotic. His primary goal is not peace, but leverage. His demands, cessations of territory, Ukrainian elections, a minerals deal benefiting the US are politically and militarily disastrous for Ukraine. The suggestion that Zelensky calls elections while fighting a war is particularly absurd, as it could easily destabilize the government at the worst possible moment. Even if practically an election could be considered, how do you do an election in a wartime when the polling stations could easily be targeted? More crucially, Trump's unpredictability has spooked everyone involved. Putin fears Trump's erratic decision-making, which might result in sudden escalations. Meanwhile, European allies worry about being left in the cold. The EU's attempts to organise its own military aid package without US support reveals a bloc scrambling to prepare for a world where Washington is no longer a reliable partner. And the biggest beneficiary of this uncertainty is, ironically, Putin. The more the West argues over Ukraine, the easier it is for Russia to press its advantages. Confusion benefits the aggressor. At some point, even Putin must confront reality, though. This war has cost Russia thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives, damaged its economy, accelerated its isolation, and if Ukraine can hold firm and secure further Western aid, Russia may ultimately be forced into a genuine negotiation. But Putin is unlikely to pursue peace in good faith. His strategy has always been to buy time, consolidate power, strike when the opportunity presents itself. And if a ceasefire is agreed, it will be because Russia wants to rearm, not because it's ready for peace. The cracks in Putin's strategy are visible. The Russian elite is growing restless, sanctions are biting, the military is stretched thin. If Ukraine can resist the pressure to surrender too much, it may yet push Russia into a position where it has no choice but to negotiate from a place of weakness. Ukraine's war against Russia has reached a pivotal moment. The withdrawal from Kursk, Trump's meddling, and Western hesitations have placed Ukraine in a precarious position, and the next few months will determine whether Zelensky can hold the line or whether Ukraine is pushed into a dangerous compromise. For now, Ukraine is battered but not defeated. The war is not yet lost, but without decisive Western backing, it could be slipping towards a resolution that serves Putin more than it serves peace. Zelensky needs to tread very carefully. Capitulate too much and Ukraine risks sacrificing everything it has fought for. But hold out too long without Western support and Ukraine may find itself abandoned, fighting a war it cannot win alone, and as ever, Trump's shadow looms over it all.